morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Alison Rodriguez, and as President of the International Federation of Translators, I welcome you to this webinar hosted by the FIT Indigenous Language Standing Committee as part of the FIT webinar series. Now, we're glad you could join us today, and our panelists will be discussing the role of Indigenous language translation in the midst of climate change, negotiating displacement, loss of land, language, and culture. Now, there is no doubt that our world is changing as a result of climate change, or what we now refer to as the climate emergency, and we're beginning to feel the effects of those changes in the physical world around us, and its impacts are extending to culture, way of life, and language. The heating of the Earth will make vast areas of the planet uninhabitable, causing displacement and a migration crisis, the like of which we've never seen. Now, when people spoke of being a climate refugee in the 19th century, they would often be describing someone who had moved to a land where the climate was healthier or more agreeable. But in this century, we will be moving because the land is simply no longer. Climate change is now considered an active factor or participant in every event. It's what's known as a threat multiplier. It exacerbates great power conflicts and ecological catastrophe, making it more relevant than ever in today's world. Its effects will impact the profession. The more people will move, the more we will need translation and interpreting for a broader range of people and languages, for coping with migration flows, for disaster relief, for issuing warnings and communicating essential information. Communication will be crucial and must reach all people. However, at least 40% of the more than 6,700 languages spoken around the world are at risk of extinction. Losing those languages would mean a loss of cultural diversity and the centuries-old knowledge contained within them, which could solve the current global challenges around climate destruction and biodiversity loss. Much of the historical learning and knowledge about this planet is Indigenous knowledge, and therefore translation and interpreting for Indigenous languages is key to unlocking that crucial knowledge. Very few, less than 2% of Indigenous languages have any real online presence, and this means that millions of Indigenous language speakers and signers are excluded from full participation in society, and it shows the need for the intentional development of a truly multilingual digital landscape. And this is why the Sustainable Development Goals are part of the solution. The Sustainable Development Goals bring to the forefront the importance of people in the future of the planet. Sustainability and climate action are not as much about saving the planet as they are about saving the people. And that includes our land, our languages, our identities, and our cultures for all of us. Sustainability as a guiding principle helps us to push back against the idea that the future is what happens to us and not what we build or what we create. Sustainable Development Goals are a blueprint for human agency, and we must use that agency for change. So in this decade of Indigenous languages, to draw the world's attention to the critical loss of Indigenous languages and the urgent need to preserve and revitalize and celebrate them, we're pleased to present this global panel discussion around Indigenous languages, translation and interpreting in the midst of climate change. So I hope that you will enjoy and learn from our presentations today, and I will hand you over to the chair of our Indigenous Language Standing Committee, Rula Salam. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Alison. And I wish to welcome everyone who's joining us, and I wish to echo Alison's sentiments wherever you may be today on the occasion of this important session on the role of Indigenous language translation amid climate change. I know that we agree as we attend this session that our world, as Terry Teachy of the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations describes it, is currently a world that is out of balance. The effects of climate change on the world have disrupted the lives of Indigenous communities, and indeed the first people to notice climate change are those very people whose connection to the land, to the water, to the elements, to the ecosystems is so deep that even the smallest of changes may have a great impact, not only on their way of life, but on their social values, their knowledge, their culture, and their language. This imbalance of the world has been a burden carried over from one generation to the next. It has affected social, linguistic, cultural, political, and demographic realities of Indigenous peoples for a long time, impacting language revitalization, knowledge sharing, and the passing down of oral traditions and worldviews. The importance of cross-cultural and intercultural communications on climate change between Indigenous peoples cannot be stressed enough. To share common values and ways of contending with and resisting what the late elder Dave Corshane from the Anishinaabe Nation, founder of the Turtle Lodge International Center for Indigenous Education and Wellness in Manitoba, described in a summit on climate change in 2021 as a problem rooted in Western values and economic systems brought about by colonialism. From here, from where I live on Turtle Island, commonly known in the Western world as Canada, I would like to share with you my own version of the land acknowledgement that we use here. I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, play, raise my children, and practice my faith on Treaty 6 territory. This has been a gathering place for the Nehiyaw, the Blackfoot, the Nesuchin, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other First Peoples, whose histories, friendships, kindness, languages, and cultures have inspired me and others to continue to inspire much of the work I do as an activist at heart and an advocate for human rights. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session from all over the world. From Canada, I'd like to introduce Wayne Jackson from Goodfish Lake First Nations Treaty 6 Territory, Alberta. Wayne is an instructor, a resource developer, and director of Nehiyaw Cultural Institute in Edmonton, Alberta. And he will present on Nipi Pima Tikihoyak, how water sustains us and gives us life in relation to language and culture. I practiced reading this in Nehiyaw, and I'm sure I did not get the pronunciation 100% correct. And the second presenter from Canada will be Dr. Marilyn Shirt from Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta. Marilyn is the team lead for the Indigenous language program at University Blue Quills, and she will present on the impact of climate change on Indigenous language revitalization and translation. From Arctic Russia, we have Xenia Dubrovskis, lecturer of translation and applied linguistics, and she will focus on climate change discourse and its anthropomorphic specifics. Our next presenter, also from Arctic Russia, is Olga Latishiva. She is the Deputy Director of the Ethnocultural Center of the Ninets Autonomous District, and she will present on translation of Ninets folklore and climate change evidence in oral texts of the Ninets people. Olga will be assisted by Maya Lutyanskaya, who will be interpreting for her. Maya hails from the Arkhangelsk region, and she is a qualified interpreter who completed her postgraduate study in linguistics. And currently she is an associate professor at the Department of Translation and Applied Linguistics. From South Africa, we welcome Sibusiso Biela. Sibusiso is a science and research communicator for ScienceLink or with ScienceLink, and he is based in South Africa. He has done extensive research on the Zulu royal family and the KwaZulu-Natal province, and he has done much work documenting the lifestyle of Indigenous tribes in South Africa. Sibusiso will present on applying the principles of science communication and decolonization and translating the science of climate change into African languages. So I welcome you once again, and thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I would like to invite Wayne Jackson, our first presenter, to present on his topic.
Oh, tansin tu team ting na ako magantig. Anigan, tanse, anin, abe washted, darin astara edlanate, anin. Saying our greeting in all our languages here in Alberta, Canada. Almost machi tayane. Before I start, I love to always start with the way we do things at University in Hilatini Thoughts and Stumi Magna Blue Quills, or even other places where I present any work I do. I always start off with we have something called buffalo sage that we pick and harvest on our lands, and with that, we smudge our to give us cleanse us, to give us strength, to send our prayers to the Kshamantu, Creator, the kind one. So I let that, and I'll share a little bit about who I am and why I do what I do, and yeah. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm looking for my presentation here. I had something prepared. Oops. There we go. Okay, so Nipi Ipima Chigwea. Nipi Ipima Chigwea. Water sustains and gives us life in relation to our language and our culture and our humanity, even, I would even say. So what is the role of Indigenous language translation in the midst of climate change? What was mentioned already before. We've experienced that firsthand. But before I go on here, I guess I should should tell you all who I am, even though Rulas did an introduction of who I am. I work at University of Halotini Thayotsin in Stami Magna Blue Calls. When we morphed into a university in 2015, we could have easily said University Blue Quills, but we wanted to honor our ancestors, those who had come before us and those who have bridged to us our language, our culture. And with that, because there are seven owning nations in our Treaty 6 area of that of the province where Blue Quills is. And one is Dene Sutene and the others are Nehio. So we honor that and honor that those that have come before us. Our ancestors is what it means. Those are our ancestors. And at that place, I'm currently the program lead for the Bachelor of Arts in Nehio, and where we've since 1970, and we were one of the first, actually, we were the first Indigenous led nations that took control of education in Canada. It happened at Blue Quills right on our land. So something historic for us. I'm honored to have been invited to be a program lead for that program. There we are passing on the culture and language to those students who are from our various nations and also abroad, not just within the prairie provinces here in Canada, but also even to Eastern Canada, to across the border into the United States. So we offer language program. We're offering the opportunity for people who have not had that opportunity to rediscover their language or to spend full time, even part time, learning their language and culture. We afford that opportunity for them. So that's what we do at Blue Quills. We've been doing it since 1970. It's always a transitioning and learning stage for us, but that's what we do. I'm also the director of Nihiwe Culture Institute. I've been doing some immersion projects here in Edmonton as well on the side. And I know eventually that work is going to lead me to actually coming to Edmonton full time and doing that. I'm also a host of impressions on Radio CFW, which is heard on Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territories here in Alberta, and on the internet if you can find it there. We're also, you can download an app, One Speaker Radio Network. I do work there on Sundays. I'm also a certified translator for the Association of Translators and Interpreters of Alberta. That's a little bit of who I am. And I'll get into where I come from, my community. But for our international audience, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. So this is who we are. We as Nihio people, we stretch from eastern Quebec to the eastern Quebec here. The western part of Quebec, there's what it's called Northeast Cree. And personally, myself, I do not like to use the term Cree, because Cree is actually a borrowed word. It's a French word. And if one of our elders had mentioned that what it actually meant was the little criers, when our people would approach when the fur traders, the voyageurs, the coureurs de bois would come into when they'd be approaching my boats, we would yell, woo, and this became known as the little criers. But we're not little criers. We're Nihio people. We're people that have four direction. I think sorry, my dog here is decided to be hacked up while I'm presenting. But anyways, we're not Cree. That's not our word. That word does not exist in our language. When we speak our language, we wouldn't say Cree and Inihioan is the way we'd say it. But anyways, we stretch from Quebec right up to the mountains in western Canada, western Alberta here. And probably the mountains itself probably prevented us from traversing into the coast of BC. But the only language groups that I'm really familiar with are within pretty much Alberta and our prairie provinces. So we stretch from here. We're Plains Nihioak. And our language is Nihioewan. So with that, I'm going to narrow it down. So we're going to just before I do that, I'm going to present some statistics here. So it says that Canada has probably about 70 Indigenous languages spread across. The bulk and probably about half the languages are on the BC coast, west coast of Canada. It's a warm climate, a lot of fishing, plenty of hunting. The weather is great. Thus, many people gravitate towards that area. And probably our migration patterns of the Indigenous peoples. Just going up and down the coast is a lot easier than going through forest or mountains. In 2016, it's reported that about more than 250,000 people spoke an Indigenous language in Canada. So when you break down those language families, we are part of the Algonquin language family, Nihioewan or Cree, Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Innu, Montane, Ojibwe. Those are all our related family members of the language. And probably Anishinaabe is probably the second most dominant language, besides Nihioewan, Cree, as we call it. With Nihioewan, it's reported that about just under 100,000 are reported to speak Nihioewan. Either one Nihioewan or one of the other. There are 5 dialects of Nihioewan in Canada. We speak the Y dialect. There's the TH dialect, the N dialect, L dialect, and R dialect. So those things are make for us that we can somewhat understand some of the different dialects of the languages, but even regional differences exist within our own language groups. So Y dialect goes from northern Alberta all the way down to central Alberta into Saskatchewan, almost the majority of Saskatchewan, from central to southern Saskatchewan. So there are a lot of speakers, and I really wouldn't rely on the Stats Canada, because there's a lot of people that do not participate in Stats Canada. And the highest percentage of Nihio speakers are on the prairies. Like I said, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And I got these from Stats Canada. So here's where we are. We're still arrow that's pointed here. We're located there. That's Blue Quills, roughly around that area. In 1970, like I mentioned, we took over our language, our culture, which was once a former residential school. And I'm sure Marilyn will share a bit about that a little later on. But that's where we're located. And this here, the shaded area, so apologies, I'm a bit colorblind, but I believe that's tan. That's Treaty 6 territory. That is where the Nihiog, the Denisutini, Anishinaabe, and the Nakota all reside within these areas. And up here in northern Alberta is Treaty 8 territory in the green. A lot of plains-wide dialect speakers there. They tend to call themselves woodland speakers, but there isn't actually a woodland dialect spoken in northern Saskatchewan, so I have to often correct and say, well, there's a woodland dialect over here in Saskatchewan that speaks the TH dialect of Nihioewan. So just to be aware of that. And there's also Denisutini as well, and Denny's and down here is Treaty 7, our neighbors down south, the Nakota. There's also Nakota South. There's Switina, and of course there's the Blackfoot Confederacy, the three different nations of Blackfoot speakers. So that gives you the Athabascan languages, the Algonquin languages, and the Siouan languages that are language families that are represented in Alberta. So breaking it down, this is where I'm talking about where I come from. My place is called Goodfish Lake. I think legally we're called Whitefish Lake First Nation, but this is where I grew up. This is the area that I grew up in. Now, this place has changed dramatically in the last 40 years. When we were growing up, this was the hub of our community. It's still a hub. It's still a town site. There's been development, but before that, and I'll get into that a little later, this here is more like a lagoon here. At one time, this was not as big as it used to be. And over to the left here, you can kind of see there was a shoreline here at one time. This was an area of the water that had receded in the last 30, 40 years. And I'll talk about why that happened. We actually used to have an island on this part of our lake here. And we used to, as kids, sometimes we take boats and we go over there and we traverse into the island. And if we caught some fish, we'd cut it up and we'd eat fish here on the island. That place no longer exists anymore. So it's a sad thing. This slide here is where our current health center stands. Back when I was growing up, this is where we call it Nutsugugumgusik. Nutsugugumgusik. Nutsugugumgusik was a place where we grew up. It was the elders' residences. Our language, our culture, even though we were somewhat colonized to a degree, Christianity was already in effect at that time and taking a good toll on who we are as people, but the language was still vibrant in this area. These little houses were elders, especially elderly women, often had their grandchildren. This is where we were vibrant with the language in the 1960s, 70s, even into the 80s. But now it's changed. The dynamics have changed within that. These are the people who bridged to me the language. My grandfather, Noah Jackson, late Noah Jackson, he was a very kind, very humorous man. I won't get much into him, but it's this person here, my mother, who she never actually attended residential school, so she hung on to the language. And that's her first language. That's the only language that she really very fluent in. She speaks a little bit of English and not that good. So, and there's little me here and our late sister. So that's who I pay homage to. These photographs here, this is where my grandfather used to spend his time. He was a very industrious, hardworking person up until he got sick. Behind me, I took this picture about 2 years ago. My niece took this picture. This is the lake. This is Goodfish Lake. We're standing on the edge here, and we've had to walk where our tribal administration office is. We had to walk like 100 meters. Whereas before, if you went behind our tribal administration office, the shore was right there at one time. So that shows you how much our water has receded. This was established in the 1970s, a dry cleaning plant to cater to the oil and gas industry. And yes, it bought development, it bought economic, I don't know if I could say prosperity, but it bought some economic, yeah, I guess I could say prosperity in the sense that people had jobs, not rich jobs, but jobs that they could feed their families, so changing their lifestyle. But having all this water being taken from our lakes, and our dry cleaning plant used to be located right by the lake, all that effluent, all the material, all this oil stained products, and plus the chemicals that they use to clean these industrial garments now seeped into our lakes. So now our waters are receded, and they were also polluted. Where we were able to have clean drinking water one time. As a kid, I remember going to the lake and getting our pails and bringing the water home and drinking, and it was pristine. This was about early 1970, prior to the dry cleaning plant being in our community. In the 1970s, 1980s, we could still go to the lake and swim. It was a gathering hole for us to go and swim. Every July, we'd be there. Kids from all over the community of Goodfish Lake, they'd be coming there to swim. That is no longer there anymore. So progress has allowed us to some economic development, but has decimated our fresh water supply. Goodfish Lake is catered to the oil and gas industry, but at a cost of losing our beautiful pristine lake that used to be a salmon gathering place and was probably used for millennia prior to that. So think of all these many millennial, our ancestors used that lake. It's just now polluted. Our fresh water now is being piped from many kilometers away. I believe the town of Wasatno is where it's being piped from until we can actually get our levels rising again. But we also need to monitor the effluent that's coming out of the dry cleaning plant. So we've had some economic prosperity, but at a cost of our future generations. So that has affected who we are in this sense. Translation and interpretation have been affected by climate change, as we now see the decline in use by younger generations now. There was a time when our people were proud of who they are, proud to speak their language. In the 1960s, 70s, now people became ashamed of it. And I'm sure Marilyn will talk about a few other things, but I'm also mindful of my time here, as it says here, 10:30. So I'm going to leave it at this. I wish I could stay and talk a bit more. I have another engagement here in town. I teach here also on Saturday afternoons. So I'm going to have to, I'll stay for a little bit, but I'm going to turn the floor back over to our moderators. Thank you for your time. Hi, we say in our language, kananaskumtanan.
Hi, Wayne. Thank you very much. There have been some questions for you, so in the event you have to leave earlier, we will be sure to convey the questions by email and maybe share the responses somehow. I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Sibosiso, are you ready? Okay, so I will stop my cam and mute myself.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Rola, and Wayne for the fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially your closing statement about the cost of economic prosperity being paid for by the loss of pristine water and through the pollution of the lake. I see that a lot of times when we talk about economic prosperity, it's not really brought up like we talk about it as if it's just generating wealth, but also that wealth, it's causing a lot of the cost is the environment getting damaged in some way, and that's never factored in into economic things like GDP and other things of that sort. It's never really factored in. So as I was introduced, my name is Sibusiso Biela. I am a science communicator based here in South Africa. I've done a few bits of work myself. I'll just share my screen here. Everyone can see that. So in my time here at ScienceLink, I'm gonna try. Okay. Trying to operate my slides. Okay. So as mentioned, I've done some work as a science communicator. I've worked as a journalist, as a science journalist as well, where I've done work in translating some scientific terms into isiZulu, which is my native language here in South Africa. In South Africa, we have, according to our constitution, 12 official languages. It was recently 11, and then the 12th one was South African Sign Language. So of these 12 official languages as recognized by the state here in South Africa, 9 of them are indigenous languages, of which I speak one, which is isiZulu. So after, so a bit of background, after 1994, when South Africa was liberated from the oppressive regime of apartheid, the South African government set out to develop the 9 indigenous languages in South Africa that were not recognized, because at the time only 2 languages were recognized before 1994. It was Afrikaans and English. And English is spoken mostly by white people here in South Africa. And Afrikaans in a way, although the majority of people who speak Afrikaans are not white, but it was co-opted as the language for Afrikaner identity here in South Africa. So that means like not everyone who speaks Afrikaans is an Afrikaner. An Afrikaner is a very specific ethnicity of white people here in South Africa who are the ones who were in power in South Africa, who initiated the apartheid system from 1948, system of oppression towards Black people. So for all that time, we didn't have our languages recognized by the government and throughout the country. So in an effort to fast track that that development, the South African government put it in the constitution that there should be strategies put in place to make sure that these languages are promoted. And one of those ways was trying to develop them for science and other technical activities, because at the time they understood that if you're able to develop these languages for science, then they'll be used in a lot of scientific endeavors into the future. So since 1996, when these plans were put in place, not much has happened. There's lots of policies that we have, and that's the thing about South Africa, is that we have a lot of amazing policies. The issue just becomes, when are we able to implement them to some degree. So some of the work that I've done has been trying to enact those policies in some way, to sort of help the government in a way, but also to not wait for the government for some of the things that we're trying to do. So one of the projects that I'll be talking about here, this is from a recently published paper, in which I'm one of the authors. This was an invited commentary for the South African Journal of Science. I think this was the August issue. Yes. So in it, we just wrote about this podcast called Ilugulugu. Ilugulugu is a Zulu word that stands for curiosity and passion. So the curiosity and passion that we have on the podcast is a curiosity about the world, and a passion of sharing how Zulu-speaking people are able to see the universe, and trying to develop language that we can use to speak about how we see the world through science. So on the podcast, with every episode, we try to come up with. So I think of a scientific term that's usually in English, because all of the ones that we use start off in English. And then by the end of the episode, we will try to have either a definition or a new translation for, like, try to coin a new term based on how the discussions that we've had almost exclusively in Zulu throughout the episode. And the conversation style that we have on that podcast is such that we invite listeners to engage with us. On the episode, we'll put out some feelers on social media asking people what they think about this topic in science, what they think it means in isiZulu. So that's how it happens, and there's been a lot of successes in that, with a lot of excitement from people. So this is an article I wrote. It sort of started. It sort of set off a lot of fires around the world about the decolonization of science writing, specifically through translation. And in this article, I was just talking about trying to write an article in isiZulu about a South African dinosaur discovery, and the difficulty of trying to do that when you don't have the word for dinosaur in isiZulu, or deep time, like millions of years, or what a fossil is, and all those things. So that was quite a challenge, and I talked about it here in this paper. This is another highlight. I can share some links later if anyone's interested. But it was a profile about me in Nature Chemistry from a couple of years ago, where we were just talking about the language of science, and how we're trying to, with the work that I've been doing, how we're trying to create materials, digital materials that will aid in the development of isiZulu and other indigenous languages on the African continent for science. So this is another project that I've worked on. It's called Masakane MT, machine translation. And we're just trying to teach a machine to be able to translate complex scientific terms into isiZulu using African research. And I can talk more about that later on as well. This is the project that I was talking about in some more detail. So the project, Masakane, has it's a collection of translators, science communicators, some researchers interested in language research and term development, and a lot of translators and interpreters involved in the project as well. And another part of the team involves machine translation or artificial intelligence experts who are the ones trying to gather as much data as possible to create this AI tool, because any AI tool that you have out there is as good as the data that it's given. And the reason that the AI tool that we can think of right now being the best at the moment, being ChatGPT, it has an enormous amount of data from basically everything that's ever been written on the internet, all the text for it to be able to sound vaguely creative in some way. It takes a lot of data to do that, and like billions of dollars. I'm sure you've heard about that, but we were trying to create from scratch our own data of translations, and it's taken a long time, but the achievements that we've found from it is just the collaborations that we've been able to have. Okay, so speaking about just using the principles of science communication when it comes to translating science, and also the whole thing around climate change, is that as a science communicator, I approach it as why do I want to communicate science in isiZulu? Like, what's the benefit of that? Why do I want to do that? For myself, at the beginning, it was just out of passion. I wanted to talk about something that interests me in my own language, and for other people to see that it's not that they don't understand science because they're not smart enough to understand science. It's just that it hasn't been made in their own language, that they feel welcome to take part in understanding, in making use of science. So this wheel here at ScienceLink, we call it the Science Communication Planning Wheel. It's basically all the things that you have to prepare as a science communicator, and in this case, in terms of translation as well. So whenever I talk about this, I always mention that when you try to translate any scientific thing, you automatically understand your audience and your own aims, right? Like, why don't you just communicate with them in English? Like, they do understand it, right? But like, why do you want to specifically do it in isiZulu? Because you see a lot of efforts when it comes to translation, including around climate change as well, that they will create, a lot of scientists and organizations will create climate change materials in English, and then after the fact, they'll translate it. But when you try to do scientific translation into isiZulu from the beginning, like that's your starting point. You're going to take slightly different approaches from doing it in English, because when you are a Zulu speaker and you read something that's been translated from English, like, you can immediately tell that it's translated from something else. Like, it's not structured in a way that it's speaking to you directly, right? So it can be disappointing that you'll see a lot of effort and money being placed into just translation at the end of a science communication effort, when the translation itself should have been part of the beginning of why do you want to create these materials. Would it be helpful to create them in English first? Maybe, but like, you should be looking at it from the perspective of a Zulu speaker speaking to another Zulu speaker, and what they will appreciate if you translate it in some way. I was going to go through these as well, but won't be too much time. But also, there's this saying that the medium is the message, right? You might do amazing work translating scientific terms, especially related to climate change. But if you can't reach your audience because, let's say, maybe you create those Indigenous language materials for climate change, but then you put it on TikTok or some other social media, is it the best place to reach them? If it is, then it's great. It might be that you have a local radio station where it's not enough to just create these materials and hope someone will read them somewhere. You might be working with the local presenter of the radio station, maybe someone like Wayne, right? And in that instance, the way that I would approach it would be, if I'm a scientist and I wanted to speak to the local community about some scientific thing, I would work with someone like Wayne to say, how do we structure this message in a good way that it will reach people? Or even talk to someone and ask, is this a good message for me to try to convey to people, right? Like, you're working with local people who understand the language. You're not just asking someone who knows the language to translate it after the fact. You're working with them throughout the whole process. That's the activities and platforms, and it also informs your messages and stories. This was an example of how I was trying to come up with the word for dinosaur, and the translation and how it worked out. Just go through this quickly. I can get into detail about this as well, but it's more of a strategic thing of how do you translate a scientific term, or coin a new scientific term without having to approach the language board of your country or region and create a lexicon and all the stuff. Like, a lot of lexicons exist that have tried to do things like that, but no one uses them because the audience itself weren't involved in the creation of these materials. So the biggest thing is that it's important to not separate good science communication from translation. If you try to do one without the other, it can tend to not reach the audience you want in the most correct way. So, and I'll give more examples on that with the discussions that we're going to have later. This slide that you're seeing now, here, it's the background is that we were given, the company that I work for, ScienceLink, we were given some slides to translate for the local community who were suffering from dirty, polluted air from a nearby landfill, and our task was to translate the complex science that would be found in there to try to make it easier for the community to understand. And we realized that it wouldn't make sense to do that, so we sort of translated it into more plainer language, and then we went from there to create a much shorter, more easier to understand material in isiZulu. And from that, the community was able to comfortably oust the local company that was causing all this pollution based on the information that they were able to better understand. Because if you try to speak to someone in English about a complex scientific thing instead of their indigenous language, there's already a trust issue between the audience that you're trying to communicate with and science itself. And not because they don't understand, they can understand. It's just if you don't teach someone something well, like, it's your fault that you didn't teach it well, not their fault that they didn't understand it. So it's one of the biggest reasons that we want to improve science communication into these indigenous languages is also for the trust part as well. And trust also comes with working together with the community you're trying to communicate with. So yeah, that's just some of the final thoughts on that. And yeah, this is the advice I usually give to scientists or anyone else trying to translate or communicate this science. I think out of time. Yeah, so yeah, that's the, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Bosiso, for a very interesting discussion. And we can already see some connections between your work and Wayne's work as well. So I'd like to welcome Olga. Olga Letisheva will be presenting next, and she will be aided by Maya, who will be providing interpretation.
Nani torowa sida manamani mindbim sida manamani yangarma sini ngarma tarem meseuna man sida mincha vadavna yattam.
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. I greet you in my native Spanish language. In translation into English, greeting will come as follows. After I saw you, the earth has become bigger and my heart has become bigger.
Man nyane nedn толыр канда тяня на хитри ятер хат передн ног хатда няны ненцене толбова серкана себе йонар себе ю коханатет ю йонар мат ютет ю идум дева ненцей округ ханангани ненцене си уйонар самлянг юрма.
Hello, I'm a Nenets person, a representative of the indigenous people of the North. According to the results of the census of 2022, the number of Nenets in Russia is 44,640 people, of which 7,500 people live in the Nenets Autonomous Area, where I come from.
Мань этнокультурный центр хана Мазрам. Мута гэнлэн. Ненцей вадава культурава нерня мире. Тики хау хана аспиратура хана Манзарам. Сидни профессор Александр Поликарпов нядаби. Неухи илим и падерци вади сома. Ненця вадахат луцы вадавна падваення диссертация уна.
I work as a deputy director of the Ethnocultural Center and deal with the issues of traditional culture and language of the Nenets people. I'm a postgraduate student of the Northern Arctic Federal University, and at the moment I'm working on a thesis under the guidance of Professor Alexander Polikarpov on ethnocultural aspects of translating Nenets folklore texts into Russian.
Ненця ильвадо ябан нюсерна. Нюсермадо вылна вина. Мал сини ватолна ngödü ilir. Ядернемне ngödü тады колты берте няби. Халина ngobiyim махат вина. Ненця ты берте. Халина няби йорте. Ил махеты булам тасла. Ханян гусуведо харта йивнанда иле.
All the nomadic life of the Nenets people is spent in tundra. Moral values, deep knowledge of the environment, norms of behavior constitute the organic unity of tundra people and nature. The Nenets have managed to create a peculiar culture of reindeer herders, hunters, and fishermen, which is quite rational in the given natural and climatic conditions.
Ненци ямидхи ила сайыр иилip цохана унондхана табикохана манып амбиттир. Тян сеняна малтики ненця илеркана нгарка хибирихат ngачмбой хибириха табдавда мес. Валакада тикари тики юрхалпай.
Traditional knowledge of the Nenets people can be clearly traced in their spiritual culture, in sets of rules, beliefs, subtle and accurate observations of nature. In the past, this knowledge existed throughout a person's life and was passed on from elders to the youth. but now this connection has been partially cut.
Нинти юмасы, сини вато, нинти погана, тамдanya, или Нgadбянда, теми ялахана, милви илибни бадерци вадисоми маламбава, падбава сиро сянанхат, тарнанге пернадо.
Some of this knowledge and traditions still continue to exist in the culture of the people. In this regard, the work on collection and documentation of oral folklore texts becomes very important.
Таславы манза яханан, венги ненченга, милви илибни бадерци вадисома япта салиндир ненченга на. Теда, кэтвы бадерци вадисома, Сидионар матьянгanya похуй комплексную экспедиции сборникан, интявадам на нюмдивы, ядмаковна, ябиуцевадам на нюмдивы, группами предков.
The study will present the textual materials of a group of tundra nenets, Kanin nenets. The oral texts used were published in the collection of the complex expedition entitled Paths of Ancestors in 2016.
Икихауна тамна, нининга на падви, ману аптагун. Манстара, падви хибири, несыхна илиня, нинти автономной округы, япта салингер нинтя.
I will also present the texts recorded at present. It should be noted that all respondents are nenets from among the sedentary reindeer herders of the Kanin tundra of the Nenets Autonomous Area.
Япта салингер нинтя млюслагиду, ngaка пытняю нина, таняна нусерна.
The nomadic roots of this group of tundra nenets lie on the territory of the Kanin Peninsula and near the peninsula.
Невхи илибни падерци вадисома, япта салингер нинтя вада, равнана. Малавы падвы нинтя вадахат, луцавадан, яха самболна сертабей.
Samples of folklore texts are given, taking into account the phonetic and morphological peculiarities of the Kaninsky Nenets language. The text materials are given in Russian translation and in English translation, taking into account the principle of fidelity to the original, accuracy of the transfer of content, and preservation of the appropriate narrative style.
Мал синей ватовна нgeде хибри нямна. Я илипцо нямна, нgamke тики харги мен сямен хат тарна ngamge. Ни бяв, ни сяв, япта салингер тыбырте хатна. Хада надо, ири надо. Муктарем тика хана нусерпы.
A lot of traditional knowledge about man and nature is common knowledge, but for me, this knowledge is a deeply personal topic. I come from a family of hereditary reindeer herders from the Kanin Peninsula. Several generations of my mother's and father's families have roamed the tundra.
Haswa nyamnya, ngachigi poni, si upongesa nusina wahana bayarats. Tohon don vanji, yolchengamani, miat meru sugu nare nunawa yala malgana turnanis.
My childhood years and those of my elder brother until the age of 7 were spent in nomadic areas. Later, we returned to the tundra only during winter, spring, and summer holidays because we studied at a boarding school.
Мне нинти хебиди ibidor mavnana, numnyana, numdanya. Mal ilinya ngamgarim serta bay.
According to the mythological ideas of our people, Num, the patron of weather, the creator of all living things, the supreme deity of the Nenets, is in the sky.
Нинтя масты. Сарем сырым, хехетувей, num yaняю ngedramбида, тики хауна, течтам дамби, харцянго, тась мянна.
According to the Nenets, Num controls snow, lightning, rain, and storms, but can also destroy life on Earth and send cold. This is how it came to be that the word Num in the Nenets language is used to mean God, sky, but also weather.
Кенеду, мякана, сидю махаддана, мани нецикине, тарчи юнравал денисити. Небя, тюку яля нумда хурка. Небяо, ngani масти, тюку яля нумда сава. Ngani, тюку яля нумда вева. Пылсюм выняна, ngokтерим вадина, нумнямна лести.
I remember the first question our children asked their parents in the morning was about the weather. What is the weather like today? And parents would answer, today is good weather, or today is bad weather. The day also ended with a question about the weather tomorrow.
Минси иум гэта было серкана хуркари пунум таня. Hani savanyadi выванум нямна вана. Инзиледа. Сям пунум тхетгум. Пылсюм сарю майдана. Хая радит. Тамна пун выванум эгу.
There are numerous folk wisdom in Nenets culture that tells about the upcoming good or bad weather. For bad weather, the saying is, if the sun appears in the evening during the rain, there will be bad weather for a long time.
Ана леде пирча хой санар пато. Нум вонда. Ики пунум выванум толуе мяхетна.
Another wisdom also says about the weather, which will also soon be spoiled. If the high hills visible in the distance, the weather will be spoiled.
Вингана. Пусувай хиби емня харта сава няби выванумда. Диберкяхана. Танги сата мерчи сава. Тарча нум еп яхат нинченгахат нинчам нуямби.
Every Nenets in the tundra has its own bad or good weather. For a reindeer herder, weather with a strong summer wind, even with rain, will be good because it helps the reindeer to get rid of mosquitoes and heat.
Yorke ngani tarchi yalam volta bido. Tarchi nungana. Hamba nganohana mimasir yangu. Hamba pongam putta bido.
For fishermen, the same wind creates many inconveniences. It makes it difficult or impossible to travel by boat, and the waves entangle nets.
Yorke nyahar iyala bud kurkangawa deniwa. Nger nyanger ninde tir junya haya nunda savunda.
Fishermen can guess the weather before it comes. If the clouds from the north have risen upwards, it means that the weather will improve.
Savanum, merche sedanum, ngani yorke hanon nunado. Valkada tarchen nutni. Hutnya banta num tehna sach pilkapti.
Quiet weather, on the contrary, is convenient for the fishermen, but turns out to be hell for deer due to the abundance of mosquitoes.
Yor manirchuna, ты берке халылха сырна. Чу унямне чирпато мирчи мунгу. Тикахана yornyam мензил тембидо.
Before fishing, reindeer herders observe the behavior of seagulls. If they fly high in the sky, it means winds. Then fishing is postponed.
Ngapchata, ты берке саунум ялинга берна, сяха техна савун дамби.
In general, the Nenets reindeer herder considers good weather not what is pleasant for him, but what is good for his reindeer.
И дилip цохат, Нум гадперила, нинти хибирим тяга самболна, я керни хана, или вада ямбан павламбис.
Complete dependence on nature and weather forced the Nenets people to study the world around them thoroughly, to notice the smallest details in nature, to catch and establish regularities and connections of some natural and weather phenomena with the other.
Вынги нинтя ватовна, идай понюки, аяр ин савы турна. Сырдовам хаяр имери нибер, нюки хаймо сырым даби.
According to the traditional Tundra Nenes calendar, the calendar year begins with the appearance of the first rays of the sun. The Nenets mark the beginning of winter not only with the appearance of the sun, but also with the first frost.
Кыпка бе ерийне, тырке, январ ерий япты саленгер нентине, сата течді епне хетна, тартинун гына, кыпка харт манигу.
The name of the month of January, the month of the axe breaking from frost. Among the Canaan Nenets, it suggests that the frost is so strong that even an iron axe breaks from wood.
Нентя теньва, сяха хат, танзер тута, ся мальгаван, течда вайрангут, лакри унитур, масти, харт, майы уйт, хадн берна, хадне ханта.
Nenets know that if blizzards and storms have come, frost will go down. For Nenets, they do not come unexpectedly. One Nenet's wisdom says about the coming blizzard, "Northern lights are playing, wait for a blizzard."
Ngaju diket lakri tona tsirasawai tечда буна, вингir yam salavange hana beda. Tarchinum tehna veva, tiberma yabondam, niyam etane hanta.
Due to thaws alternating with frosts, the snow becomes covered with ice crust, and it makes difficult for reindeer to get food from under the snow. The icy pastures become unsuitable for reindeer grazing for a long time.
Sata merchi sawai tanzir kana ngamgehar naju. Tarchi vevanum kana tibertia tido iramba ser kana yolche petna.
Blizzards, accompanied by snowfall and high winds, reduce visibility and require extra effort from herders to manage the herd.
Manstara, tarchi iditma nirmyana yibame antana wahat unipil kaptyo. Ya yil nganja hena yibame hantan wahat. Ya serm yumna yepnya tamna ngamgajiki yepnya wewa. Wuni lahana, tamna hurkari uchonnoi lahana.
It should be noted that seasonal warming is nothing compared to the rapidly approaching warming in the north as a whole. Climate change, thawing of permafrost in peat soils, and other phenomena are claimed not only by prominent scientists, but also by the Nenets themselves.
Yepnya si uyuru nyahar pota mani den Надежда Латышева Вадим Анама Мамдара Кеда Нинсиму Латка течти ялу Ибарканга хая Яна Нусеу Мальгана Удалтады Тю Умасир Янгу Сети Сач Теть Сети.
To confirm the above said, I will cite a piece from the oral story of my mother, Nadezhda Latышeva, who is 73 years old. These days, there are really no hard frosts. It is warmer. In the past, when we used to roam, you couldn't even take your hands out of your mittens. It was very cold.
Nari Tovu Yepnya Napoi Punum Lahana Wingana Punancho Maginda Tikibut Narene Hanta.
The arrival of spring is signaled by a Nenet's wisdom connected with the appearance of the tundra bird of a passerine family, which the Nenets called punansa. In Russian, it sounds punachka, snow bunting in English.
Punansi kirti munda punums vadahadam gibay.
The name of the bird, punansa, comes from the Nenets verb punomts, with the meaning to find out, to clarify.
Punansi yemnya punum tanya. Ning incha masti. Punancha ko maginda maray ko nga hanta.
The full text of the saying related to the snow bunting is as follows. The Nenets say, the snow bunting has appeared, spring has come.
Keda siro o pong ni pili. Naranga mer hanga. Suyo kohot mer adivirna. Namada awradam do temda mado. Mer hardahat hanga. Chinil. Manchana hardahat mai virihana mirki yalehana istivala.
All the reindeer herders who now live in the settlements say, now even the snow doesn't last long. Spring comes early. The reindeer calves are born earlier. The reindeer herders leave the settlement after stocking up their food. I remember when we used to leave for summer pastures in the beginning of May.
Narato mada vingana panyanganyana kirke mumso. Habel ko tulsiu yapto. Nango huhore lotseo.
When spring comes to the tundra, here and there, you can hear the calls of birds. Partridges, sandpipers, geese, ducks, swans, and rough birds.
Iki kirtiam mincha lorcelngai individu. Mahkut sirp lorcaraha nadibanda tamna lorcakne fernado.
Nenets call these birds lortsev or lortsak. The literal translation of the bird's name is like a bump. When they see a flock of rough birds, children start calling them.
Lorcel, noi piu pito, lorcel, tar piu pito.
Rough bird, lift up your cloth. Rough bird, lift up your fur blanket.
Vânălăbăi tircea, năcichi vadi put teritara piastido. Paskoi ikdo tondo panim tabdapsiti.
Frightened birds, in response to the children's call, start dancing and showing their beautiful multicolored collars. These feather formations on their necks in the forms of fans. The fans, shimmering with different colors, remind that the tundra summer is coming.
Nebia umasti, paskoi ikhananda mincha ne hannoi pim manu măki. Paskoi noi pim slaihanda, slaihana manutara.
From the oral story of the 73-year-old Nadezhda Latышeva, we understand that the inquisitive eye of the people caught the similarity of the multicolored collar of the bird with a bright multicolored cloth, a kind of a coverlet for a woman's sledge. The traditional coverlet is presented on the slide.
Tamni yaля urtari esti. Yepte ayalu tuberte nidu muni. Sata yeptям ngai totari voltam bido. Yepte yaля hana ты мыдал цикы. Исялам зипы.
Summer days in the tundra are different. Reindeer herders do not favor hot days at all. Strong summer heat is considered as bad as winter ice. In hot days, reindeer get diseases such as foot rosary and rabies.
Tehna sata merci sava. Nadibanda tamni nusirma явняю мила. Нырм яле нумга табы яле раха. Tehna tarci яле хана цет сава эсти.
The reindeer are saved by strong winds. It is not without reason that the reindeer herders' summer nomadic routes run towards the sea. Cool days are a gift from the gods for reindeer herders, because reindeer are especially well and at ease.
Вингана таңы пилкаптёда нgamgы майырка. Сямен хат ненадо ненянг. Курка санга вота таңы нэнгу напой пунун хетви. Миртей ненинг нёчко эпто майырта ока эгу. Арка эпто майырта тянь эгу.
Perhaps another fierce element of the summer tundra is small insects. The most popular among them is the mosquito. The first mosquito was used to determine how hard the summer would be. If the first mosquitoes are small, the summer will be full of bites. If they are big, there will be few bites.
Нинти яли падаркандо нинянг харто хыхы яли титanya. Нинянг яли не пернадо.
In the Nenets,
Сиимди яли хананга. Тамна Иван яли не пернадо. Луца хыхы яли падаркандо.
In the Nenets calendar, mosquitoes even have their own holiday, Mosquito Day, which is celebrated on the 7th of July. I should also note that this day is also called Ivan Yala, known as Ivan's Day in the Orthodox Church calendar.
Мань стара, луца хыхы яли нинти илер пери ян болнато. Тарти яли иум хета балхана, нахат таня. Тени вадо, пункт намна, луца няби нинтя тинisi ильва емня опна.
It should be noted that all Orthodox holidays, including this one, organically entered the Nenets culture with the partial adoption of the Orthodox faith back in the 19th century. The use of Orthodox holidays in the texts of folk knowledge testifies to the close historical connection between the Nenets and Russian peoples.
Olga, may we please conclude shortly so we can stay on track?
Ольга Ефремовна, нам нужно заканчивать, потому что уже время поджимает, надо сократить.
Так, тогда мы...
Скажите мне, какой слайд?
Ага, сейчас минутку. Что-нибудь такое, наверное, наконец, наверное, да? Так, давайте начнем с 37-го.
Седьмой. Смотрите, пожалуйста, это... Сейчас, может быть, так не сориентироваться.
Это стойбище зимой.
Ага. Так, значит, вот здесь. Вот это, да?
Да. Стойбище зимой.
Все, открыла.
Нины нинтя вадамна, я нетхи таби пованум таслава емня сать старнангамге. Пунуп тибертям ханинан илеркандандо нядагу.
According to the interviewed informants, the use of traditional knowledge in everyday life is to determine the weather, and it is very important. Not only that, a good knowledge of natural science is of great benefit to the Nenets. It helps to predict the weather for the near future, as well as its changes.
Я еутеда вуни мали дарцинга. Курка тян сенянангас сывыхана сыра тянюмя. Я сырен юни. Я лыгны, монга сенга, несе ильня надимя, намде мокма.
Respondents noting climate change assess it by the following attributes: the amount of snow in winter, melting permafrost, collapse and shrinking of land areas, the appearance of new species of animals, plants, insects in the tundra, which they couldn't identify. They say, I can't name them, I don't know what they are called. The appearance of mosquitoes and midges in the tundra and changes in vegetation.
Майя Михайловна, давайте на 44-й. Ребенок стада оленей. Вот. Тарему хэта дара мани ненти хибирине теха самболна ятирни или ятирняна или и илипцом илм хэта булам сахранби.
Thus, I would like to emphasize once again that my Nenets people have solved and are solving the issues for their existence in harmony with nature, wisely and reasonably. From generation to generation, the traditions of careful attitude to the surrounding world have been passed on. For many years, the Nenets have not caused any damage to nature. It would be very good if the traditional attitude of the Nenets people to nature was reflected in the worldview of our younger generation.
Хибри няби илипцо ngognya ilma ninti nyernya mingri. Я метхи ила савир падарти вадисо ахнанда таня.
The unity of man and nature inherent in the traditional ethnic consciousness of the Nenets is vividly reflected in the myriad of folk sayings, rules, and commandments.
Ninti падарти вадисо ма тики нерни хибри. Илма хэта была намга тики. Найт бянда сахарамбая. Натикихе летамбая. Ninti авадахат. Ними вадахат сертабая. Най хибри тини вапнандо саванерна.
Nenets folk knowledge in the form of oral folklore texts, being a part of the entire cultural heritage of the peoples of the North, could become a guideline for careful attitude towards everything that surrounds a person. That is why it is important to translate Nenets into other languages, so that this knowledge would be available not only to Nenets people, but also to the speakers of other cultures, both in our country and worldwide.
Явда еледа, ну сидда няда бая.
Be happy and may God be with us. Thank you.
Ималда.
Thank you very much, Olga and Maya, for an excellent job at interpreting. And I'm sorry I had to intervene, but we have to be mindful of time so that our other speakers can also get the chance to present. So I'd like to welcome Xenia to present and share her screen. She'll be using a PowerPoint as well.
Hello, everyone. Now I'll try to share my screen with you. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see, but we don't see you, Xenia.
Unfortunately, I can only I can only show myself or show my presentation.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you.
Let's see. Thanks. So I'm Ksenia Dubrovskih from Organised. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Translation and Applied Linguistics of the High School of Social Sciences, Humanities and International Communication at Northern Arctic Federal University, named after Mikhail Vasilievich Lomonosov. As you can see, we are located in the northern region of Russia. And I'm going to tell you about English climate change discourse and its anthropomorphic specifics. At the borders of the internet discourse, with other types of institutional discourse, special special areas emerge. Climate internet discourse can be included in such areas. I consider climate change, climate internet discourse as a related area of electronic communication and discourse serving communication on nature in general. According to Michael Holliday, discourse should be described on the basis of 3 parameters: participants, topic, and method. Thus, for the climate internet discourse, the participants will be the users of the global network, whose interaction is the main factor for the implementation of online communication. The topic of climate internet discourse is communication about nature, ecology, and climate change in all its manifestations. And the method is an oral or written form of communication mediated by the global network. In my study, climate discourse is seen as a special type of institutional discourse that serves a broad sphere of human activity related not only to the study or description of climate and climate change, but also to ecology and nature studies. A necessary characteristic of such discourse is its correlation with environmental issues, the interaction of internet users, and the presence of digital tools such as computers. This way, climate discourse is close to the concept of the environmental discourse. A set of oral and written text of various communicative and speech spheres, science or journalism, fiction, business, and everyday communication, and genres conditioned by the situation of communication on environmental topics. At present, the climate discourse has been modified. Initially, the discussion of climate change, its causes and consequences were conducted within the professional community. But now, such discussions are moving into the sphere of mass media discourse. What is happening in the climate and nature in general is now discussed not only by scientists, but also by representatives of mass media space with the reliance on official data. Climate internet discourse is becoming a sphere of communication and discussion on climate topics by everyday users of the global network who, however, are able to shape and change it themselves. Ecological discourse is close to our understanding of climate discourse. Its key concepts and themes are nature and environmental protection, which are also the main concept of linguo-ecological study of language, which involves consideration of the interaction between language, linguistic personality, and the environment. In this case, language is an integral component of the system of relations between a man or a society and nature. The functioning and development of language is presented as an ecosystem and the surrounding world as a linguistic concept. In the linguo-ecological approach, language and linguistic structures are considered as a system of unit structures interacting with the surrounding world, and in connection with this, it is impossible. It's impossible to study language in isolation from its natural and cultural environment. And this is indeed true. Collective knowledge about culture, society, and nature is fixed in human consciousness with the help of linguistic means, which in turn form the worldview of the speakers of a particular language. The study of linguistic manifestations in the representation of process and phenomena of nature can provide answers to the questions about how people perceive reality and see themselves in interaction with nature, since ecology and environmental protection are becoming more and more significant components of the life of modern world community. Information about environmental processes and phenomena, about weather cataclysm, in particular about climate change, is increasingly penetrating into the communicative activity and of society, and consequently into the text of all types of discourse. Linguo-ecology relies on an anthropocentric approach and examines language behavior through interaction with ecology in broad sense. Objects and phenomena of nature are the main parameter necessary to conduct such language research. The human being is considered in interrelation with the surrounding world, and more precisely, the processes and phenomena occurring in it. Taking into account the fact that human consciousness is anthropomorphic and perceives reality from the perspective of the mental and physical organization of a man, the images coming from reality inevitably adopt human features, because in this way it is easier and clearer for man to comprehend the world around him. I also rely on anthropocentric approach and consider objects and phenomena of nature from the point of view of human perception. I understand climate discourse as an oral and written form of electronic communication, which implies virtual communicative interaction of internet users on topics involving the study of nature in its broadest sense. It means in ecology, climate change, and description of natural phenomena, etc. Let's further consider communicative genres on the example of climate internet discourse. This type of discourse unites texts created not so much by environmental scientists, climatologists, and other nature specialists, but by journalists, media representatives, and ordinary speakers of a particular language. For example, all users of the global network. At the same time, it should be pointed out that these internet texts are most often based on real data on the state and dynamics of the climate. The genres of climate internet discourse include websites, forums, blogs, public pages, propaganda and informational electronic posters, and online petitions. In my study, I use such genres of internet texts with the climate orientation as blogs, public pages, and websites as material, since the text of these genres abound with an anthropomorphic speech means. While investigating, it became evident that one of the distinctive features of English language climate internet discourse is the abundance of anthropomorphic metaphors. Anthropomorphic metaphor is a mean of representation of anthropomorphism, a way of cognition of the world, and that humans are inherently predisposed to metaphorical perception of the surrounding world. Linguistic anthropomorphism is an indispensable and inevitable property of any human cognition of the world. Man unconsciously gives nature human features to the features in order to understand and perceive it in the most precise and concrete way. At the same time, it should be recognized that anthropomorphism helps to structure and order consciousness. Anthropomorphism and language are inseparable. Anthropomorphism is fixed by means of language, which in turn bears the anthropomorphic stamp because it's a creation of man himself. Anthropomorphism is realized and presented in linguistic means. Many cognitivists, for example, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, emphasize their predisposition to metaphorical perception of reality as a peculiarity of human consciousness, because a person subconsciously uses cognitive associations when cognizing the surrounding reality. Back in the times of antiquity, Aristotle noted that the essence of metaphor consists in understanding and experiencing the essence of one kind in terms of the essence of another kind. It is easier for a person to comprehend the structure of objects and phenomena of reality by analogy with the functioning of his own organism, or by empathetic analogy, that is through attributing human emotional states and feelings to inanimated objects and phenomena. Okay. Through metaphorization, it is possible to personify inanimated objects of reality. All this points to the fact that metaphor as a way of transferring physical and emotional states and characteristics of a person to the surrounding reality is one of the representations of anthropomorphism in speech. Metaphor is both a way of perceiving the world and a means of mental structuring. Metaphor allows to reflect the surrounding reality more accurately in human consciousness. It is an important part of representation of the surrounding reality in speech. And thanks to anthropomorphic metaphors, natural phenomena are linked to humans through cognitive associative links. and adopt psychological and physical characteristics of humans. And in speech, they begin to behave as full-fledged animate beings. The whole variety of anthropomorphic metaphors of climate internet discourse can be grouped into the following main types. The first time, that's the basis of biological man. A human being is a living being to which certain states and stages of development are inherent. Here you can see under number one, the example of this metaphorical type. Tornadoes are usually born from thunderstorms. The second type is anatomical man. It represents structure of a human organism. And also you can see here an example of the metaphorization. We hope to spur your interest in understanding the full range of processes by which the solid Earth breathes over geological timescales. The third type is is social man. So a man is regarded as a member of a society. And here is the example. The success or failure of this experiment could determine whether communities around the world start using a new tool that marries nature and finance to protect against the effects of climate change. And the last type is functional man. It means likening the style of human action. And here is the example. If this intermittent influences of the Arctic on the mid-latitudes won't fundamentally change the overall trajectory of winter climate with global warming, then why is the subject still such a hot research area? These types of English anthropomorphic metaphors suggest that they can also appear in the verbal sphere in the form of anthropomorphic verbs, which are also a means of representing anthropomorphism. Thus, the English language climate internet discourse is based on the anthropocentric paradigm. It develops specific genres that reflect the identity of this phenomenon. Such genres can be considered as one of the distinctive features of this type of internet communication. Climate internet discourse abounds in anthropomorphic metaphors, reflecting anthropomorphic cognitive associative basis of human cognition of the world. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ksenia, for a very interesting discursive approach to climate change. And we started with Canada, and we're going to conclude with Canada as I give the floor to Marilyn Shirt to present on her topic. Marilyn?
Danse, kakio, tatams. Nigana nanaskamo se mantu gamia kumaktakiskao. Egwa tatamskatno. So first I want to thank Kind Spirit for giving us this day, and I want to greet you all. And I can't see my video, and I don't have a PowerPoint, so I've turned on my camera, but I can't see myself, which I guess is okay. So I'm not sure exactly now where to start. My daughter just came in and she said, I was telling her what I was doing, and she said, oh, like the story of colonization, she had heard that the story of colonization is the story of climate change. And perhaps in some ways it is. And I know my husband says that, colonization is a natural process. People, there's always movement, and imbalances occur, imbalances in our body give us disease, and we try to regain health by bringing that balance back into our body. So for First Nations people, some of the effects of language I'm just distracting myself because I feel like I'm talking into the air. I can't see anything. I can't see anyone. And so it's a little disconcerting to me.
We can see you very well, and you're
Okay.
doing great. Yeah.
Okay. Even if I saw myself, that would be great. But in any event, so language loss in First Nation communities was affected by incarceration onto the reserves, the boarding schools, and then the pass system. But even that in itself, you know, like the acceleration of the language loss within our communities occurred with when the pass system ended, because then this meant that people moved off the reserve. So prior to that, even if people lost their language in the boarding schools, they returned to their communities, and because they were isolated in those communities, they still retained the language. Also, the other effect was the loss of, or the banning of, ceremonies. So ceremonies, you know, a lot of the ceremonies contain our knowledge, our history, and our worldview, and our relationship to each other and to our environment. At the same time, it's probably the pass system, you know, when that stopped, also the introduction of TV in cars. And so as a result of having TVs in cars, it's now we have coming into our communities, coming into our families, coming into our living rooms, English. And with youth and our young, you know, youth and young always create change, and also are in a time when they're wanting to explore the world. So being, you know, having access to music and contemporary music, those are the things that they gravitate to. And so all of those things contributed to language loss. Part of the result of that language loss is that we start to lose, and isolation is we start to lose words that were once common, you know, so a lot of the flora and the fauna and those types of things we begin to lose. We have a harder time remembering them. We have to search for, you know, older fluent speakers who can remember those words, or even as not far back as when we were using horse and wagon. You know, we don't know those parts of that, of how to hitch a horse to a wagon any longer, or it's not as readily available, and even our older fluent speakers are having trouble remembering it. It's disconcerting not seeing myself. So in the last conversation that we had about anthropomorphic, and also in what Olga shared, I think that what First Nations, what Indigenous people can bring is their view of the world. You know, so it's like there's not only a multitude of languages, but there's also a multitude ways of looking at the world and placing ourselves. So what we find ourselves as First Nations is having scientists come to us and say, we want you to participate in our dialogue because we want to know how you view the world. And so for myself, climate change has in some ways opened the door for people wanting to know how we view the world. And it's also an opportunity for us to regain all of that knowledge that we once lost and make it once again common knowledge. You know, I grew up, my mom used to tell me some of our Wisakitak stories. And I remember inviting some people. And so this was a ceremonial holder, young woman that was a ceremonial holder. And she did not grow up hearing these stories. And it was very surprising to me. And that's the common knowledge that we don't have. Why we have our ceremonies, that's common knowledge that we lost too. And then it's in those ceremonies, and we have a whole number of ceremonies and stories that are attached to that ceremony that give us our worldview and our understanding of how we're related, that we have to regain and we have to transfer to our young people. And our young people now are in a place where they want to know that and want to learn that. So one of the things is, it's not, so in our worldview, we are a younger sibling. we are not at the top of the pyramid. We're a younger sibling. And we're related to everything, you know, and everything has a spirit, and it's not just a metaphor. So the difference between a metaphor and a lived experience. Right? So it's not something that is unreal. It is a reality. And I think now science is kind of like beginning to understand, you know, when they look at, you know, how water changes structure, given our thoughts and our intentionality and our words, you know, being able to, you know, have things that are showing the sounds or the songs that plants sing if you attach electrodes to them. So all of those are sharing with us that, you know, these beings are communicating with each other and possibly communicating with us, but we've lost our ability to hear. And so I think that's one of the things that we can bring, is that one, we're not the center of the universe. We are a younger sibling, and that in our reality, a lot of these other beings have made a pact with Creator and said, okay, we will take care of this younger sibling. So we as younger sibling also have responsibilities. So the you know, the concept of Wakutwin, which is, you know, relatedness, it's not just relatedness to, you know, our families or just our nuclear family. So for Nehiawak, the nuclear family is not just, you know, my brother and my sister from my mom and dad. It is my mother's sister's children. Those are my brothers and sisters. My father's brothers, sisters, and children. That's my family. That's my immediate family. Those are my brothers and sisters. So it changes the whole view of how we would relate to one another and our responsibilities to each other. And then all of those beings, all of that exists in creation, those also are our brothers and sisters, you know, and who have, you know, made an obligation to do something for us. So now we need to be looking at how we are treating our family and how we're relating to them. There was a comment that a friend of mine, you know, he was saying that, you know, we used to go to New Zealand and to a conference there, and at that time, this is quite some time back, and they were starting to talk about climate change and the fear. And so he went to his community and his elders, and he said, you know, like, there's this thing going on, and you know, it's kind of fearful. And so they took it into a ceremony, and then they came back and they said, we have gone through periods of change, you know, big change in the world, and that and we've survived, you know. So for us, it is a matter of how we choose to look at that, you know, like climate change, and how we are going to move in that, and maybe going back and remembering our responsibilities and our obligations to our relatives, and also relearning skills. So in a lot of ways, you know, when you think about colonization, it's not just the land, it's also, you know, like thought, you know, like religious thought or spiritual thought, maybe I should say, worldview, you know. So with the banning of ceremonies, you know, it changed, that colonized us. And then with the boarding schools and the pass system, having to undo that, that slavery mentality that we incorporated. So it's like today now, more and more of our young people are not quite in that same mindset. So they're wanting to have educational determination, educational sovereignty. So we're now looking at our education, you know, and we're saying, do we want to follow the path that the education system is giving us? Or do we want to go back to our own thought, our own history, our own knowledge, you know, and the way that we view the world? So so I think for us, you know, it's going back to that and saying, you know, like, we need to relearn old skills. If climate is changing, then we need to go back to being able to observe, like Olga was saying, in you know, that people live on the land, and it's not just, you know, it's years of knowledge and years of history and years of cataloging, that much as a scientist would do, in terms of looking at and observing what is happening. And so in a lot of our communities, maybe not necessarily all of the Indigenous communities, but in some, the loss is greater, where people are disconnected from the environment, and, like, I think I was talking to my colleague, Kevin, and I said to him, like, our education system is doing us disservice, because it's like, not only are we failing in terms of the Muniao system, so the white system, but we are also failing in that our kids don't know how to light a fire. They don't know how to chop wood. They don't know, how to plant a garden. They don't know how to harvest. They don't even know how to, prepare a meal or to plan for meals. That is the failure that we have. So we have to go back to those things to teach people how to live in the world that they are. If, if there was an energy crisis and we no longer had power or oil or gas, most of our houses now are heated by furnaces. We would all freeze because we're not prepared. So I think that's the idea, for us, is to look at preparedness. In terms of language, we're always kind of like on the back foot. It's, I think, around the time of the, the advent of the TV and the cars, we didn't realize that we were going to lose the language, or to the extent. And we have some communities that are still like that. They still have children that speak the language, and so they don't actually realize the threat that they're under. So those of us that are in places where the language loss is significant, we are having to face things that we have. Well, one, money. There's never enough money applied to it. We have to, and so along with the money, there's not enough research in terms of, like how the language is structured. So Nehiyawewen is structured differently than English. So whereas, English, when you're learning English and you're learning how to create sentences, in Nehiyawewen, you have to first learn how to create words and then sentences. So, and the way that Nehiyawewen has been taught in the schools is based on, simply translating English text. So there's all of that. I feel stressed for time.
You have time. You're doing fine. Yeah, please go on at your own pace.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. So for us, that's part of our like in terms of language revitalization. There is so much research that we need to do in terms of finding those old words that we've lost. There is so much research that needs to occur in terms of how to teach our own language. Like, what are the morphemes within a word, and what do those morphemes mean, and what are the rules for putting them together? So to use that as a way of being able to teach our non-fluent speakers quickly, and so that we're more effective in teaching in the language and teaching the language to our own people than simply translating English to Nehiyawewen. And then on top of that, then there is the scientific language. And in some ways, for fluent speakers and able to talk about the natural phenomena, the natural things, and it would probably be quite easy. But for more scientific terminology, or even terminology like miles. So creating a video about moose facts about the moose, and we're talking about, and we're using the terminology of kilometers or meters, right? And so our translator had to then decide, okay, we have to translate the idea of kilometers into miles, because we have a word for miles, but we don't necessarily have a word for kilometers. So there's those kinds of things, and that we have to take into consideration. There is, but I do want to go back to that whole thing of, how we view the world. I remember when I was going to university in the States, and I was studying psychology, and I had a class, and there was, they were into kind of like the idea of shamanism. And so somebody wanted to talk about inviting all of those spirits. So they started chanting, in English, rock spirit, we are calling. And then they went through all of these things. And then they kind of like, doesn't that feel good? Let's go for lunch. But for me, so that's kind of like, let's do this thing that kind of feels good, but we don't actually acknowledge that it is real. And so for me sitting there, it was a really weird experience, because it's like, okay, so do spirits understand English, for one? And two, they just invited a whole bunch of spirits into the room, and then they didn't even acknowledge them, thank them for coming here, ask them, say what they wanted from them, and then say goodbye. They just invited people in and then left. So it's like a different mindset. So it's like, it's not a metaphor. It's not metaphorically speaking. It is a real experience. It is a real thing. It's like going and sitting by a tree and asking that tree, like, for help. So it's like, we had an old elder, he's since passed, and he talked about, struggling in his life, and then going and sitting in the forest and praying and leaning against the tree, and then having that tree talk to him and give him guidance. Or my husband, who was really struggling at one point in his life, and he's from New Zealand. So he went up to the trees, and he found a very old tree, because a lot of the trees in that area were decimated with colonization, with the settlers coming in. And so he was sitting by that tree, and he was crying, like that there was no place. He was having difficulty finding a home in their small reserve. And so, and then he heard very clearly in his own mind, the grandmother there saying, don't worry, like we're here, we have a place for you. You will have a place. I'm not saying it correctly. It's an old grandmother voice telling him that there was. And then shortly after that, he was his auntie gave him sold him some land. So it's like, we don't know how to listen. We're so fast. We're so stuck in our rooms, and in our, we're not out there living nature. And I'd say that for myself, as I was listening to Olga talk, I was trying to remember my dad and what he was saying about, what sundogs mean. And it's a change in weather, but I can never remember if it's a cold change in weather, or if it's a, what kind of change. What kind of a change if it's a sundog only on one side? What if it's a sundog on both sides? What does that mean in terms of the weather? And I'm not outside enough. I'm not quiet enough. I'm not, I feel too busy in this life trying to find money for the language program to sit and have those restful moments where you can hear. And I think too, it's like, I probably also don't go enough to ceremonies where the ceremonies are providing you an opportunity and a space to talk with another, with the spirits, with creator, with the earth. And for myself, in terms of the earth, Hikawi Noa Ski, our mother, I think she'll be a long time here than us. We're just we're a young sibling. We're not that important. She will outlast us, and who knows what will come after us. So it is one of the things with language revitalization, so climate change provides an opportunity. I think we can, like, as I was thinking about what Kevin was sharing, and it's like, we have an opportunity to be so afraid that we don't act or don't know what to do, or we use it as an opportunity in terms of language revitalization. We take it as an opportunity to regain our own language, to regain our own knowledge systems, and to move towards that, because in knowing that, and in knowing who we are and our place in the world and how to live in this world, then we'll be in a much better place to survive whatever life throws at us. It's like, yes. The other opportunity is that, the world and scientists I think are more and more open to trying to look at the world differently. Maybe not everybody, I think that those that truly really care about the world that they live in want to know a different way of looking at things, so that you have things that happen like in New Zealand where they've in our worldview, they've given life or a personhood to a river, you know, which I think is quite significant for us in this world. I mean, in this worldview that we're living in, that's the, you know, that's the big worldview. I shouldn't say the big worldview, you know, but the you know, how the white world thinks of it. And I'm sorry for saying white, but you know, how the colonized world thinks about it, the major Western thought. And that, you know, Western scientists wanting to understand how we view the world, I think that's a big thing, you know. And it's a harder one to, I think, change, because, you know, like in English, when you talk about, you know, like Wakutwin, and okay, this is an animate being, it's harder to talk about it than it is in Nehiwewin, because in Nehiwewin you don't have to explain that something is alive and something has spirit. It's embedded in the language. So it's that kind of a shift that I think probably needs to occur for people, you know, is to start thinking from a different kind of lens, from the lens where you're the water and you're being affected by, you know, what somebody says to you. I remember doing a research project on tobacco, you know, because tobacco is a sacred herb for us. It's used, it's the herb that walks before us. You know, when we're going to make supplication or ask for things, we usually, you know, ask the tobacco to help us in our conversation, in our community. It's a translator. It helps us to translate, you know, our thoughts and our thinkings and our intentions to spirit, to in that environment. That's the job that it said it would do. And so it's been abused as well, you know, so now people are smoking it not necessarily to pray, you know, not necessarily to communicate with spirit, but because they have an addiction to it. So in that conversation, I don't know how this came up with the elder that was there, and we were talking about, we must have been talking about water, and he said one of the things that you can do is, you as a human being, you can go, you know, to the river, and you can offer some tobacco to the river or to the body of water, and you can pray for that body of water, and you can pray for good intentions, and in that sense that you know, you can help clean that water. For us, we do flags and offerings, and I think through colonization we started to use, you know, like fabric and ribbons, but more and more we're going back to what was our tradition, what did we use traditionally for our flags, and the flags are things that represent our prayers, our thoughts, and our intention. So and this was way before the information came out with people saying, you know, the Japanese scholar who was saying, you know, like, this is how the crystals in water are impacted when we say certain words or have certain thoughts. And so at that time, I thought that was very interesting for him, you know, saying that we, especially as women, because women's role in terms of life, as bringing life into the world, and women's relationship with water because of that, with tides and the moon, and that making those offerings would help in terms of healing water. So I think, you know, in doing those kinds of things, we have then create an intentionality in relationships with water that would maybe cause us to act differently in general to water, you know, and that it's, you know, that we don't treat it as a commodity, you know, that we treat it as a living being, much as we are living beings. And I don't know how much time I have left.
Yeah, you have a couple more minutes to kind of wrap up, and then we'll open the floor for the discussion among the panelists.
I like what Sibusi said about, you know, creating, you know, having those podcasts to dialogue about, you know, changing language, because it's always the case of, you know, like, there's so much work, so how do we do it? And I think that would be, you know, a really fun way of engaging people to create new terminology for different kinds of thoughts that exist in the world today. And so I want to thank Sibusi for that. That's really really awesome. And in each of us, I think, in Indigenous people all over the place and minority language speakers all over the place are all going to have different kind of experiences of suffering and challenging. Well, they have right now, but increasingly with climate change. Some of us, when Kevin was talking about, like perhaps, we've experienced flood, but I don't know that we would experience flood where we are. Perhaps we would experience desertification. I have no idea. Certainly the Inuit in the far north are struggling now with land loss, much the same way and much the same things that Olga was saying. Us, like we there used to be bears, and then there was no bears, and now the bears are returning. We see animals that we don't see as well, like raccoons. Raccoons was not an animal that we saw in our area that we see now. We have our words for the seasons. Our words for the months follow seasonal events. Like this month is Ikupiupism, which is frost on the moon, frost on the trees, or frost month. Well, there's hardly been any frost this whole month. So seasons are changing. There's still geese flying around. Where they should have already been gone. There is not a whole lot of snow on the ground yet, it's not really cold. Tina's husband isn't able to find anything because it hasn't gotten cold enough. So there's those kinds of changes that happen, and then for some people that I think that we probably could weather those changes, and then for some people I think it's going to be hard for them to weather, and there's going to be all kinds of movement globally. With people shifting and changing, and it's an interesting thing. It's like, Wayne talked about BC being having the most languages. It has the most languages because it's very mountainous, so people are stay in small spaces. Like for us, the way that Good Fish is like maybe 20 minutes away from where we live. But they have a slightly different sound to how they talk Cree. Those are our relatives. We have aunts and uncles from that community, but the language is slightly different. So oftentimes it's not the distance, but how often and close together you live. So it'll be interesting. If climate change also affects like Utenigan here in the future. If climate change affects where people have trouble moving around, then perhaps it'll return to supporting smaller language groups or even creating new language groups. Like for example, I remember reading this book, some random small little book about language, and there was this interesting thing about that French guy. There's a movie about him right now. Napoleon, his brother, studying languages in Europe, and how there were so many small different language groups in Britain. And Britain is a small land, right? And it's not really mountainous, but people didn't travel very far from their communities. They stayed there, so that isolation creates language changes as well, language shifts. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting how people do it. And for us, whether climate change is here, whether it comes quickly, we always have the same problem of how do we deal with getting resources and funding to promote language revitalization within our communities. Thanks. Hi. I don't know if I have any more time left, but I feel like I'm going to start rambling now. So
Hi. Thank you, Marilyn. I'm going to open the floor now for an open discussion between the panelists. I've asked them to share any comments and questions, any interesting observations that they may have for one another for the next 20 minutes or so. The last half hour of the session will be devoted to the questions and answers from our attendees. I know they have been patiently waiting to ask their questions. So I'd like to invite any of the panelists to start the conversation. Maybe I can take the lead and then encourage our fellow panelists to follow with their questions. So I've seen that from listening to the different interesting presentations and reflecting back to the state of the world being in a state of imbalance, I think that what there is in common, or the two things that I have identified in common in some of these discussions, are we have to find ourselves. And the second thing is we need to find the language to find ourselves and to express ourselves, which is a challenge when so many odds are working against us. As Marilyn pointed out, technology, the language of the colonizer, or the widespread use and existence of English in our living rooms, in our daily lives, has made our younger generation feel that it's not the cool thing to do to learn, their indigenous languages. And this also applies to many other languages for, people across the world. So maybe this will be an open question, and any of the panelists can answer if they so choose. How do you see collaboration happening? I know that Sibosiso had expressed an interest in Wayne's work in the aspect of broadcasting, and unfortunately Wayne has to teach, so he cannot be in this discussion with us. But maybe we can start looking, or starting. We can start with this question on collaboration. How can we help, or how can you collaborate to kind of overcome some of the struggles, or to provide a platform for yourselves, for each other, to communicate as you teach, as you translate, and as you reach out to the younger generations?
I think I'll start. I might lose power and the connection at any moment, so hopefully I can get this thought through. So in terms of collaborations, the project for myself that I worked on, with the podcast, as Marilyn mentioned, is so important that we thought, even if we don't reach as many people as we intend to, just the excitement and the strategies that we've used so far, it might be helpful to others in different regions around the world, or different people trying to engage in the same way with their own communities when it comes to these translations. So we've shared, like in that paper that we wrote, we've shared our successes and the challenges that we're facing with the broader scientific community and anyone else trying to make these translations. So for now, I think it's to use these platforms where we know other people like ourselves would be interested in reading being other scientific papers. So hopefully we see a lot more examples of the work that we're discussing today, the successes and the challenges, so that we can collaborate further, so that we don't make the same mistakes that others have, or we can prevent others from making the same mistakes that we have, or even just learning from other people's strategies, different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the world, in solving the problems that we're trying to solve, in this case, like Marilyn mentioned. Yeah.
Any other questions and observations or comments between the panelists are very welcome as well.
I have something, Rola. This is Tina. Yeah, about the climate change right now here, as Marilyn mentioned, it is towards the end of November, and usually we have at least two inches of snow. And when she mentioned about my husband, he's hunting. He's teaching our son, he's 14, how to hunt, how to live off the land. We have a wood stove only, and we're teaching him how to chop wood, how to bring in the wood. That's his job. That's what he does. So he's for the past 2 years, we have been teaching him. He's had his own garden. We're teaching him we're starting at home to teach him how to live off the land and off from the garden. We're older parents, so he's 14. So we want to ensure that with this climate change, because what that brings also is a change in how we hunt, how we the hunting season is over in 4 or 5 days. So that maybe if we continue to have these warm weathers, maybe that has to change with the wild game and fisheries. So these are the things that we look at because, yeah. And that's just my comment about that. I really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I wouldn't mind asking Sebastian what his thoughts around the AI. That's just come up recently with the translation of Indigenous languages with using AI, and I'm on the fence about it and wondering, like, I wouldn't mind to know more on his thoughts on that.
Sibosiso, are you still with us? Because I know he had unfortunately in South Africa, they have blackouts regularly, and he was messaging me that his battery was dying and that he might have to disappear soon. Another one of the challenges. So maybe if he comes back, I think he has joined us from another device, but I think for him, in order to speak, he must be connected to his laptop, and I think his laptop is what has given out. So if he joins us, if you're able to join us, Sibosiso, just jump back into the conversation anytime. I appreciate the question, and I very much appreciate what you have shared as well, Tina, from your personal experience and that of your husband. And I'm remembering also in Olga's presentation, she had mentioned also some, species or the influx of more mosquitoes and mosquito sizes. And the language also used to describe animals, as Marilyn pointed out, like raccoons we hardly ever see in Alberta. Now we're starting to see. I wonder now when, for instance, the mosquito and certain insects that can cause diseases in forests and that can really change the balance of our ecosystems. How are they described in Indigenous languages? How do you refer to these new bugs or these diseases that we're starting to see in the forest that affect, from flora and fauna to animals in such drastic ways that people don't necessarily see until it's too late? So this question is for Marilyn and Olga. If you want to just have a discussion about that, and Xenia, you can jump in as well. And I'm not addressing it to anyone in particular. It's just to get you to think and maybe share some of your responses.
And I would like to hear what Olga has to say. I don't have anything in regards specifically to mosquitoes, but if she has something to say, then I would like to maybe address kind of like what Abdul Bari's question.
Yeah, we'll come to the Q&A from the audience shortly, but this discussion is among the panelists, so there's certainly some
Okay.
the audience.
Okay. For myself and for my community, I think it's those mosquitoes haven't really quite made themselves as significantly present. So there's not a lot of dialogue, at least in the language, and people comment on it. You know, like those things moving forward, moving up from you know. So we are watching the news and hearing, like Florida and the southern states getting mosquitoes that transmit certain kinds of diseases that they've never had before. And it's certainly not something that we've specifically experienced. So people are not necessarily talking about it within our communities. I think, like as I said, it depends on the community, and what the communities are dealing with, so in our community, it still has to do with people's housing and being able to support themselves and finding work and jobs. Those are the big major issues that people have. And health has to do around with still the same topics of addiction and a greater increase of addiction to meths and stuff. So those are the big topics. Up in the northern, like this year for northern Alberta, those communities are probably dealing with like housing and I don't know if they're connecting it to climate change, but just the fact that they got burnt out this summer, those northern communities in northern Alberta. And I don't know that they are taking time to think and reflect on the impact of the climate on those forest fires. If they're more just focused on, how do we get housing and how do we bring back people back? How do we recreate the infrastructure that we lost? Yeah.
Maya, does Olga have any comment? Would she like to add anything to?
Just a second, I'll ask her.
Yes, take your time. And Xenia, would you like to comment or ask any questions? Please go ahead. If you'd like to share any observation or ask a question. We're just waiting for Maya to translate to Olga so she can maybe share some of her thoughts.
Теперь буду говорить по-русски. Я хочу поблагодарить всех участников вебинара, особенно представителей коренных народов.
Well, now I'm going to speak Russian. And first of all, I would like to thank all the participants and the organizers of this webinar.
Мы живем на разных континентах, но у нас много общего.
And especially the representatives of indigenous peoples, because we live in different continents, but we have a lot in common.
Когда выступал первый докладчик, если я не ошибаюсь, Вейн Джексон, он провел обряд, связанный с дымом, обряд очищения. У нас тоже такое есть.
When Wayne was talking, he showed this ceremony of having smoke. We have similar things in our culture, a kind of a cleansing or cleaning smoke.
Это было как обряд благопожелания, чтобы во всем мире обратили на климат и решались вопросы для того, чтобы сохранялись языки коренных народов.
And this helps us to really we are wishing that in all the world, people start thinking about the situation, people start looking for solutions and saving indigenous languages.
Ну, а теперь добавлю относительно комаров.
And I also can add something about mosquitoes.
Со мной рядом, хотя я уже не юная девушка, со мной рядом до сих пор живет мама.
And in spite of the fact that I'm not a young girl anymore, my mom still lives with me.
Все знания и традиционную культуру я получаю от нее.
And all my knowledge about traditional culture I get from her.
И вот когда я работала над этой темой,
And when I was
тогда,
working at this subject,
кроме того, что у меня есть экспедиционные материалы, я задавала ей вопросы прямо сегодня.
and besides having materials from my expedition, I asked her a lot of questions, even today.
И вот действительно изменение климата повлияло на насекомых, на комаров и на мошек.
And it's true, climate change has had an effect on mosquitoes and midges.
Они теперь появляются гораздо раньше, потому что стало теплее, листья распускаются и комары появляются раньше.
They appear much earlier because it has become warmer, so they come earlier to our places.
Если мошкара, которая появлялась гораздо позже, раньше, то сегодня она появляется одновременно с комарами. Комары и мошки появляются в одно время, в начале июля.
For example, we used to have the situation when midges always appeared after the mosquitoes. So we used to have mosquito season and then midges coming. These days, they come together at the same time in the beginning of July.
Для оленеводов, которые ведут до сих пор традиционный образ жизни, оленеводство, это очень плохо, это бедствие для оленей.
And for reindeer herders who still live this traditional way of life, it's really bad. It's a disaster because it's very bad for reindeer.
Ну вот, я попыталась вам рассказать про комаров.
So this is my comment about mosquitoes.
Could I add a comment, Olga? I mean, Rola, it's not about mosquitoes, but it's about COVID. You know, so one of the things with COVID being a new illness and people being isolated or having to isolate, there was a lot of resurgence and renewing of knowledge regarding natural remedies for health, particularly those revolved around the lungs, you know, because the COVID was initially kind of like focused on the lungs. So I think in that sense, when I think about this thing with mosquitoes, then it's like people are having to go back traditionally to look at alternative ways that they may have in their own knowledge, you know, in their own historical knowledge of how they deal with certain things. Yeah. Or things that may help with the present situation.
This is very interesting and important, and I thank you, Marilyn, for this observation too. It really also makes a difference. Some indigenous communities don't have the luxury to think about mosquitoes or to dwell on, excuse me, the language used to describe some of these phenomena. Pardon me. because they have to contend with problems such as housing and unemployment. And unfortunately, that's the situation in many parts of Canada, and why we really work very hard to support our brothers and sisters who are in this predicament, and at the same time are working so hard to teach their languages and to teach the younger generations. So, you know, Bloom has this pyramid, this hierarchy of needs, where you have to meet the basic needs before you can move on to the next. And sometimes working very hard to meet all of those challenges at the same time is very difficult. I thank you so much for your contributions and the exchange between the panelists. I'd like to turn to the questions from the audience. So first of all, we have many words of thanks that you can see from Nita, USA. Laura is a seasoned environmental advocate, and she's very interested in what the government's approach via their language organisms and others on this issue is. She's asking, is there a legal framework with its implementation? And have main decision makers been invited to solve the ecocide unfolding everywhere with a wide and wise action roadmap from native language speakers? I guess this question is for anybody to answer. I'm not sure what sort of approaches governments have taken. Maybe we can can speak to Canada and see if any interventions or approaches have been made on the part of the government.
I actually don't know what the government has done. I'm mostly focused on, you know, language revitalization within the community and trying to create speakers. I have done some work with my niece who works with scientists and communities in BC. So with the scientists, you know, they're trying to look at how, you know, their worldviews and how that impacts their work. And then with the work that she's doing with BC is trying to align the English language with how the mainstream language speaks about environment and nature as a whole, and is doing a lot of work in BC with communities who have perhaps been disenfranchised from their lands, and so working on oral history and to recreate or to remember their laws in regards to land and how they treat that land, and doing work in terms of establishing parks or preserves for land. And so it's an interesting case, I think, in BC, because they have that at the same time, and then they also have, you know, what's happening in Wet'suwet'en, where, you know, people are trying to protect a certain area of their land from the oil industry. And so there's, you know, both those kind of approaches, I think, in Canada, where you have people wanting to do something different and wanting to treat the environment and wanting to work with climate change in a different way. And at the same time, you still have the need for, you know, people, you know, feeling like there's a really big need for oil and extraction of resources from the land. So who wins? I have no idea who will win, but there is, I think, movement towards, you know, wanting to look at the land and resources in a different way. They just have to remain positive.
That's, I think, the most we can do at this point. And thank you, Laura, for the question. It's a very big question with many ramifications, difficult to answer in one, you know, with one response, I suppose. We have Georgianne Weller from Mexico City. This question was intended for Wayne, and I know Georgianne and Wayne, along with myself and other individuals, are on another committee. So Georgianne met Wayne in Monterey, California. I don't know. I'm going to ask the question and see if either Tina or Marilyn can answer. Could you talk a little bit about the need for interpreters from the Algonquin family, any particular field like legal, medical, conference, etc., in the context of climate change? And, you know, with considering that we've had wildfires and floods, maybe there would be a need for interpreters in remote areas. So Georgianne is asking this question, if there is a need for interpreters from the Algonquin family.
Tina, did you want to respond?
For me, the question is, is there a need for Indigenous languages, the Algonquin languages? I can only speak about Nihiawiwan. And for translators and interpreters, I think there is a need in the legal and medical fields. I don't think there are any, if any at all. And I think that there is a need for such. Yeah.
I can. So at Blue Quills, there was some year back that we were tasked with translating a number of medical pamphlets for the province of Alberta, and that was we utilized the elders that we have, that we work with, and that was a little bit of a challenge for them. I think that there is still places where you need medical, you need interpreters for elderly who are don't speak a lot of language to describe, to talk about what their needs are in the medical profession. Is there a lot of translators? I don't think that there is a lot. I think that some of the major, you know, like Edmonton, probably in some of their hospitals would have access to that, but it's not like a big thing that's available to everybody. And then communities are starting to, you know, like in terms of self-determination, re-looking at laws in certain areas within their own communities. And I believe that it's a mixed bag, at least in Saddle Lake, you know, where people are, you have fluent speakers who are involved in the process, and non-fluent speakers who are involved in the process, and and within themselves they have to translate, you know, those things, and whether they translate them in Cree or whether they write it in Cree or whether they write it in English. I think right now, unfortunately, the preference is, even if they may have discussions in Nehiwewen, they write those laws in English.
Thank you, Tina and Marilyn. We have a question from Paulina from Buryatia in Asian Russia. She writes, I'm impressed by the talk delivered by Mr. Sibosiso. She was commending Sibosiso on his talk and pointing out the importance of the technological aspect or the technological issue in the framework of science, the way he described it. Our colleague Ksenia Mariniak from Atia has also shared 2 English language translations of Russian monographs on the lifeways of Evenki reindeer herders that were published by CCI Press at the University of Alberta. The PDFs are free and they are available in the chat. So I'd like to thank Ksenia Mariniak for sharing this with us. Abdul Bari Reis, another Atia member, asks, what are the benefits of preserving and promoting Indigenous languages and knowledge systems in the context of Canadian climate change research and policy? And I guess this question is for Marilyn or Tina.
I think the biggest benefit, at least in my mind, for preserving the languages is the worldview that it presents, and also the, you know, like the interactions between the different beings in the world, and how we can maintain and achieve balance, and how we can work together with our environment. And, you know, maybe finding some way in which we can talk about those things in English, or in, you know, some of the major languages that are reflective of our worldviews, you know, not as lived in real realities. I think that would be the biggest thing for us. I just wanted to say one more comment about the last question, Rola, and that is, with Truth and Reconciliation in Alberta, in Canada, one of the things that came out of it was a need for translators in Ottawa. So that was not something that was a big career opportunity for Indigenous people in Canada, but because of Truth and Reconciliation, because of those things, because of the language law for Indigenous languages, it created that. And I think the way that we view the world in terms of how we use our language is the most important thing. It's probably Olga would probably agree with that too, I'm sure.
Olga, would you like to comment on that? So just to kind of summarize what Marilyn has said, she was responding to a question on the need for preserving Indigenous languages, or the benefits of preserving and promoting Indigenous languages and knowledge systems in the context of Canadian climate change research and policy. And Marilyn commented that it really, the crux or the heart of the matter was in Indigenous worldview. And I wonder, coming from where you are, if this is also something common that you share with Canadian Indigenous communities, maintaining this worldview and maintaining and preserving the language used to express this worldview.
Включите звук.
По поводу перевода устных фольклорных текстов или в целом языка, конечно, вопрос очень важный. И важно заниматься переводами с языков коренных народов на другие языки, чтобы знания о культуре были доступны не только носителям этой культуры данной, да, но и другим народам. Это очень важно.
Commenting on the first question about the need of interpreters, I would like to say that it is really important, whether we are talking about interpreting or translating some folklore texts. It's really important because if we are able to translate from Indigenous languages into other languages, we will be able to transfer this knowledge, culture, and make it available to many people, not only to the speakers of these Indigenous languages, but to other people as well.
Если говорить относительно моего народа, то сегодня, конечно, молодежь мало говорит на ненецком языке, и когда мы переводим с ненецкого языка на русский язык, в данном случае фольклорные тексты устные, то молодежь таким образом узнает о своей культуре через перевод.
And as for my people, I can say that young people these days, of course, don't speak a lot of their Indigenous language, language of Nenets people. And even by translating folklore texts into Russian, we managed to make this knowledge and this culture available, and we are able to teach our young generation of our traditional culture. So translation into Russian is also a tool of preserving this knowledge.
Наверное, я ответила.
So this is what I
Спасибо.
wanted to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Maya. We have a question from Alexander. Alexander is our fellow member on the committee. This question is for Olga. What examples can be given of how new terms from ecology and climatology appear in the Nenets language? After all, the Nenets language had a written language only during or only in the 30s of the 20th century. And this is in reference to the written language, not the spoken.
Спасибо за вопрос Александру. Я так понимаю, Александр, наверное, знаком с ненецкой культурой или же изучал ее. В любом случае, спасибо.
First of all, I would like to thank for the question. And obviously, the person who asks this question knows something about our traditional cultures, or at least has studied it.
Если говорить относительно сегодняшней темы о влиянии климата на язык, то, конечно же, я подготовила словарь терминов, словарь понятий, прежде чем стала изучать эту тему.
As for the topic of our today's discussion, the influence of climate change on the language, I must say that I have prepared a dictionary of terminology, of terms, of various notions before I really started to do my research.
И я хочу сказать, что поскольку язык, скажем, сегодня мы мало используем ненецкий, и я думала, что мне будет сложно найти эти термины, но к радости, наверное, да, я нашла эти термины, они есть в нашем языке, просто они малоупотребительны.
And I'd like to say that, of course, in the beginning, I was a bit worried because Nenets language is not used very much. And I really was worried that I wouldn't be able to find the corresponding terms in my language. But to my joy and to my surprise, I managed to find them. So they existed in the language. There were such notions that could be expressed in the language. But the problem was that they were very rarely used.
И, наверное, я сейчас озвучу слова, которыми я пользовалась при подготовке к сегодняшнему выступлению.
I can now give examples of some words which I used while preparing for today's speech.
Например, природа и Илипцо, климат я ил, вечная мерзлота я серен, окружающий мир я тирний, традиционный образ жизни я митхи и латир и многие другие.
The examples that were given are Nenets words which correspond to such notions as nature, permafrost, environment, traditional knowledge, and many others.
Аркавада.
Thank you.
Ну, я закончила.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the response. We have a question from Norris Del Val, who's asking, what will be some good practices in terms of confronting acculturalization related to colonization and promoting Indigenous ceremonies and cultural expressions? So I guess this question is not for anyone in particular, but perhaps whoever would like to answer can go ahead.
I'm not sure how to answer that. It's so certainly we've suffered from, the banning of our ceremonies, and so now today I think they're starting to emerge. So I'm 66, so when I was 12 or 14, there was a reemergence of ceremonies. Prior to that, all of the ceremonies probably would have been underground, people doing the ceremonies but hiding them, people doing Sundance, which would have been odd for the ceremony, people doing Sundances and then having somebody looking out for the Indian agent and then everybody packing up in the middle of the ceremony, which would, the ceremony would be odd. But, people having to do difficult things at difficult times. So today now there's a reemergence. At first, a lot of what we did, like when I worked in for Nietzsche Institute, which did train drug and alcohol counselors, and we were starting to introduce our own ceremonies, and we would have to do, before we did a pipe ceremony, even before we prayed and smudged, we'd have to talk about what we were doing in relation to how it was similar to Christianity. That smudging was similar to what people did in churches with incense, right? So we're now kind of like in a different place, at least within our community. We serve, Blue Quill serves Nehiowak and Dene Susline. And with in some of the Dene Susline communities, there's still a real staunch belief in Christianity. And along with that staunch belief is that Nehio ceremonies, Miigwapa, are devil worship. So having to, in some places, still have to change that mindset. But overall, our younger generation in both Dene and Nehioak want to know more about their ceremonies, want to know the knowledge that exists in those ceremonies, and want to live their life in that way, in a more spiritual way. So I don't know if that answers your question, Norris, but.
Thank you, Marilyn. And this question is closely related to another question from Elizabeth Saborio, who writes, I am interested in knowing where to obtain information about the boarding or residential schools in Canada, also the location of Indigenous groups in different parts of the world and how they live now. So maybe Marilyn or Tina can answer the first question. And the second part of the question, we can come to that shortly.
Tina, do you want to respond or do you want me to?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So Blue Quills is in an old exists in an old residential school, and in the province of Alberta, there used to be, I think, about 36 schools, and there now exists 2 or 3, and and for some people it's a source of pain. Like even seeing the building is traumatic for them. We have there was recently in Canada in one of the boarding schools in BC, they found evidence of bodies being buried. So that created a movement towards looking for those bodies that may, possible grave sites that are not registered as grave sites around schools, boarding schools. You could. I don't know if my email is here, but if you wanted to send me that question yourself again, and I could give you links to things that you could books that could speak to that. There's a lot now. And then we also have a little research project at our school, which is focused on doing that ground research for those bodies. And it hasn't quite concluded. We've done certain areas. There's still other areas that we have to look at. And then we have to now decide how we're going to treat that evidence, and how do we want to explore whether they're a real grave or just a ground disturbance. And if there is a real grave, how do we want to handle that? Who does that body belong to? Because in our school, there's at least 13 or more communities that sent their kids to that school. So it's like we wouldn't necessarily know who was all involved. So how do we do that in a respectful way? And so the work that we're doing around that involves ceremony and that one of the ceremonies, just as an aside, one of the ceremonies we have is called a ghost dance, and it's like happens in the fall, and it's really a feast where we invite our relatives that have gone on to come and eat with us, and then as simply put, and then invite them out also to return home. So I feel like when we do that within that school, if there's any kind of residual spirits that are hanging around, they are often they're invited too, and then they often return with our ancestors who are going back to the spirit world. So yeah, by all means, send me your email, and I will find specific information and introduce you maybe to the people that are doing that research at Blue Coals.
Thank you, Marlon. So it is on my end 12:58, and we're just 2 minutes shy of the end of the session. I'd like to ask the presenters if they'd like to share any closing comments before we thank them and end the session.
I would want to thank for the opportunity to participate. I apologize for my rough start there. It was really odd not seeing anybody or myself. And I really want to thank all of the other participants. I really gained a lot from what they shared. And that wouldn't have been possible if we did not have the ability to translate our languages and our thoughts. So hi, Mr. Nanaskum Nawa.
Olga, Tina, Xenia, would you like to share any closing comments?
Yes, tapoy ni stamina. Kinanaskong now. Ay haim stay hutafan. Kapi pihta manum kapik squig. I am thankful that thank you for inviting me to this and to hearing everyone, all the panelists, and to talk. And I learned a lot. And hi.
Olga, Xenia, would you like to share anything?
I also would like to thank you for the opportunity to present my work for such a large audience. So that was a great opportunity for me, Irina. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Xenia.
Я бы тоже хотела поблагодарить. Огромная благодарность организаторам. Сегодня мне, представителю маленького народа, удалось вещать на весь мир. И я рада, что мой голос был услышан. Спасибо.
I'd like to thank all the participants and organizers for this opportunity, because today I, as a representative of very small people, had the opportunity to talk, to broadcast my thoughts, my ideas to the very big world. And I had this opportunity to be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you also to Wayne and Sibusiso, who unfortunately could not stay till the end of the session. I'd like to thank Alison, the president of FIT. And I'd like to thank my fellow committee members on the Indigenous Languages Committee for their support. And I'd like to send a big thanks to the audience for attending and for the excellent questions and the interest that they have shown in this event. We hope to plan similar events in the future and share with you and hopefully bring more voices and bring more people together to speak on this and other important matters pertaining to Indigenous languages and culture. Thank you. A big thanks to Victoria, who has been working silently in the background, offering her technical support. Victoria is a fellow member on the FIT Council, and she has shared an important message with you that I would like to also repeat. This session has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube, on the FIT YouTube page. You can access it in around 10 days. So if you log on to, or if you go to YouTube and you search up FIT.org, you should be able to find the recording within 10 days or so. So again, thank you, and good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be in the world, and have a lovely rest of the weekend to all.